spending time with the Chief of Staff is that if he's able to be here, there's no national emergency going on right now. Is that fair?
Safe assumption.
Okay. So let me start off by asking you this. As many people don't know, and we'll go through your biography in the course of the discussion, but many people may not realize that you were the coordinator, the head of the National Economic Council under President Obama. Generally, people who work in one White House get burned out and they don't want to do it again because the hours are exhausting and so forth, and the criticism you often get. Why would you want to go back a second time? You had a great reputation leaving the Obama administration. Why would you want to go back and possibly ruin your good reputation?
Well, I stumbled into government in 2009, never having set foot. Many of my colleagues back then and today had been in prior administrations, had spent time on the Hill. I'd done nothing political. It was all business located here in the D.C. area. And so I thought I'd try it for 18 months, which is not atypical. It's sort of the average tenure, and then come back figuratively and literally home. And I spent all 8 years. And when I went with the Chief of Staff at the time, Dennis McDonough, out to Andrews Air Force Base to wave goodbye to the Obamas, I thought that'll never happen again. And what had me say yes again is, while I love the private sector, there's no equivalent to sitting around a table and occasionally making a contribution to something that matters to tens of millions of people's lives. So that opportunity to do that again, I didn't think it would happen, but it was an instant yes.
It's not the pay that you get from this job, right?
No stock options.
So, or carried interest, but let me ask you, the average tenure of a White House Chief of Staff is roughly 2 to 2.5 years, something like that. So is that because the job is such a burnout job that basically people get exhausted, or they just make so many enemies they can't last more than 2.5 years?
Well, I see Mac over here. He should comment.
Okay.
Look, by definition, what's happening in the White House is a set of really hard issues, and they're nonstop. It's the most important issues in the country, in the world, and they're hard, or they wouldn't end up in the Oval Office. So it's grueling, but at the same time, it's an extraordinary honor and privilege to be part of it. And I think naturally, at some point, one needs to pass the baton to someone with fresh legs and fresh eyes.
So if President Biden is reelected, would you anticipate going past 2 years as this job, or would you do something else, or you haven't thought that far in advance?
Well, when President Biden gets reelected, look, right now, my team's job is to govern well, and presidents get reelected when there's good governance, meaning, in corporate language, good execution, getting things done, avoiding mistakes. That's our job, and that's our focus. If there's a second term and I have enough left in the tank and the president wanted me to do something, I would be honored to consider it.
Okay, so we just were looking at a picture. You were here 10 years ago, almost exactly.
This could be bad.
I'm not going to bring in the picture out, but your hair was a little darker than it is today, 10 years ago. Mine was roughly the same. But so this is a job where you're in the office at what time every morning? What time do you have to get in?
Well, first of all, I changed my strategy to look more like you.
Right, okay.
Seems to be working.
Right.
I get up early. I delivered the Washington Post as a kid, so I still have nightmares that I'm missing my newspaper route. So I get up, I'm an early riser, get up around 4:30, but I have a routine at home, reading, getting ready for the day, working out, and then I'm at the office around 7:30.
7:30. And what time do you typically go home?
I try to be home by 8, and then have dinner with my wife, and then do a couple of hours and start all over again.
Okay, and this is 6 days a week, 5 days a week? How many days a week do you have to do that?
That's 5 days a week. Then Saturdays we spend, it's an important time with the senior team where we get a couple of hours to lift up and look forward to the next month, the next quarter. We constantly renew 100-day plans of what our priorities are, how the president's going to spend his time. So Saturdays is usually 2/3 of the day at the office. I try to stay home on Sundays and work out of the house, but I'm successful maybe half the time.
So has the way you work in the White House changed much in light of COVID and Zoom? So when you first started at the White House under Obama, there wasn't really Zooming, and you couldn't really, you had to work, you typically had to come into the office. Is that the case now?
Well, the West Wing has been in the office from day one, even though, remember, day one was in the middle of the COVID crisis. I actually was helping to coordinate the response, so I know it well. But when you think about the people in the old executive office building or in other government buildings, they were not at work. And now, the White House compound is very much in person at work, but as many of you know and many of you have talked to me about, we don't yet have the return to work levels that we should have across the federal government. We're headed in the right direction, but that's an area we need to continue to focus on.
So very often, people who wind up as chiefs of staff, like Mac, had a very close, long-standing relationship of some type with the President of the United States. Not always the case. Jim Baker was an opponent of Ronald Reagan, actually, in many ways, you could argue. So you didn't have that close a personal relationship with Biden, so how did he pick you?
Well, good question. I do have colleagues who have been with the now president for decades, people like Mike Donilon, who's now the chief strategist on the campaign, was in the West Wing until recently. I did get to know the vice president fairly well, working relationship when I was at the NEC in particular, but before that when I was at the OMB too. I helped him I think, through his transition out of government. I think you were helpful too. But then we
I gave him advice to get into private equity. He didn't do that, but okay.
And then, he asked me to lead his transition, which was sort of a dream job in many ways. So I've gotten to know him well, but you're right, there are people who have had decade-long relationships. So we work well together. Obviously, I think he's an extraordinary leader, and we have a good rhythm going in terms of how we work.
So as you look at the presidency today and the president's biggest challenges, what would you say are the biggest challenges he has in front of him today?
Well, look, I mentioned it earlier. What goes into the Oval Office, there's no easy issue. There's no obvious opportunity. It's all hard stuff. This morning, the president took off for Philadelphia, and beforehand, we met twice. And one of the areas that is particularly timely right now is what's going on the Hill, both the reauthorization of the FISA legislation. That's a very important national security piece of legislation, and even more importantly, the bipartisan bill to fund national security, Israel, Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific, and humanitarian aid, and getting that done is a tip-top priority, and hopefully across the next several days that can be done by the House and then the Senate.
Okay. Does he have any interest in going to a baseball game anytime soon?
He asked for tickets.
Really? Okay, well, let
Can
me
you
know.
accommodate?
I can think of some good places he could go, but okay. Let me ask you, let's go back to your background. Where were you born?
Walter Reed Hospital.
Really?
Yeah, my dad was in the Army. My dad's a
Your
shrink.
father was in the military?
Yeah, he's a doctor, a psychiatrist in the Army, which, being the son of a psychiatrist, probably explains a lot about me. But I was born at Walter Reed.
All right. So you were born in Walter Reed and then...
Grew up in Montgomery County, like Connecticut Avenue in the Beltway. Went to Montgomery County Public Schools, and then, long story, ended up at St. Albans for high school, and then
You went to
Duke.
Duke University?
Duke University.
Great. So good for you. Were you on the basketball team or not?
Yes, there was an intramural team that
Okay. All right. So when
after several tryouts, I made the cut.
when you graduated from Duke, how did you avoid medical school, law school, or business school?
So I always was passionate about business. I had a baseball card business growing up, pretty successful lawn service, cut a lot of lawns. And so I knew I wanted to be in business, but I didn't realize till I got at Duke that you can't major in business. But I was a political science major, which I never thought would come in handy, sort of does. And you were able to take 5 classes at the Fuqua as an undergrad.
Duke was the business school at...
Yeah. And so I did that. I tapped, and then literally my senior year, I stumbled into this concept of management consulting. So I went to Bain & Company, the consulting side,
Okay.
and did a couple of years, really enjoyed it. I mean, it's incredible exposure to a range of industries and functional areas. Most of my colleagues went on to business school, some to law school. I decided for whatever reason I didn't want to do that, and I
So you went
started
to Bain.
chasing some entrepreneurial opportunities.
Okay, so you went to Bain, and after Bain, you came to Washington.
Back home.
back home to work with somebody who was starting some bigger companies?
Well, I had tried a couple of entrepreneurial things in sort of record time. I'm looking at Susan, who's a great entrepreneur. We've worked together. I was no Susan. I was 0 for 2 within like 2 years. I was 24, 25 years old, and I think maybe this isn't the right path. And I was lucky to meet David Bradley, who was a fabulous and is a fabulous entrepreneur. He had already done the heavy lifting. He'd figured out the business formula, which became the advisory board company and the corporate executive board. I was lucky enough to be at his side as we stamped out that business formula and eventually took the two companies
Okay,
public.
so both of those companies went public while you were there,
Yes.
and ultimately you presumably made some money from that, and then you said, I don't need to work anymore, I can do other things?
Well, no, I was working away when I got a call in January of 2009 from Governor Warner, who had just been elected Senator Warner. And Mark was justifiably known as a very good manager coming from the business community when he was governor. And President Obama, when he was campaigning, talked about bringing in someone with business background to improve the performance of the federal government, management, technology. And Mark called me and said, the White House just called, they want someone with business background just for kicks. I gave him your name, you'll never hear from them. Sure enough, 2 or 3 days later, I came into the West Wing. I actually met with then Vice President Biden as part of my interviewing in the first stages. And 10 days later, on one of those Saturday radio messages from the president, which no longer exist, I was announced. And 3 months later, I was confirmed.
So your position was what?
He was the deputy at the Office of Management and Budget.
To make the government work better.
So it was a statutory position that already existed, which was really important. And then the president just added this title of Chief Performance Officer to that statutory position.
Okay, and so how long did you do that?
I did that for about 1.5 years, and then Jack Lew went over to become Chief of Staff. And when he became Chief of Staff, I became Acting Director of OMB, and I did that through the first term. Then I knew I was coming back to do the NEC job that you talked about earlier. That's in the West Wing, and it's the equivalent of the National Security Council that focused on economic issues. And in between that time, when I had this extended vacation, I got a call to come in and help with healthcare.gov.
Now,
Which
let's
is a whole other
explain
story.
that. When the Affordable Care Act passed, there was a number of things that had to be done. One of them was to get the ability for people to sign up for the health care program, and the website didn't work, as I understand it. Is that
Yes.
right?
So, this is actually, we all experience it in business too, that execution is really hard, and it's at the end of the day all that really matters. The strategy is sort of table stakes, and it's how well you can put a team together and execute. And execution is particularly hard in the federal government, and there's some pockets of strong execution, and there's too many areas where it underperforms. I think part of that is the political people who come in, who have as their aspiration their signature piece of legislation being signed into law or an executive order. And the signing ceremony is my visual for it. Everyone crowds into a signing ceremony. And if you think about it, the signing ceremony is sort of the strategic plan. And then it's off to execution. There's no signing ceremony for execution. And I think too often, as a result, things don't work out as planned. The Affordable Care Act was a huge piece of legislation. This is the famous moment when then Vice President Biden was caught on the hot mic describing it as a big
deal.
Big effing
Something
deal. And it was. But it almost fell apart because of a lousy website. Because if the website hadn't performed eventually, no one would have signed up, and literally the law would have been null and void.
Okay, all right, so the
In that period of time.
website wasn't working. You're supposed to come in as the head of the NEC.
Yes.
Why would you not say, look, I'm busy, I don't want to take a problem on that's already existing, find somebody else because I don't want to ruin my reputation. You had a good reputation. You could ruin it by not solving that problem. Did you ever think about that?
So I didn't initially, right? In fact, Dennis McDonough, who was then Chief of Staff, called me and said, would you come in for a couple of days? I know you're on a break, but come in for a couple of days and kick the tires on this. So I came in and met with all the people and sort of asked questions. I'm not a coder. I don't know a lot about technology, but I was evaluating the team and the priorities. And after 2 days, Dennis says, the president wants to see you. So I walk down the hall, and the president says, will you take this on? I think if the president of the United States asks you to do something, the answer is yes. So I said yes, but 2 days later, someone calls me who everyone in this room would recognize their name, and he basically asked a version of your question. He said, how certain are you? Because we put a stake in the ground, this is in late summer, that by December 1, the site would work smoothly for the vast majority of users. And this person says to me, how do you know that's the case? And I said, well, I don't, but it's my instinct. And we have no choice, because if you don't get it up and running by then,
All right,
he said, are you kidding me? Because you're supposed to be sort of analytic and
what
risk
was
reward.
What was the original problem, and what did you do?
I did not sleep that night thinking this very smart, sage person had thought I'd made a
What was the original problem that didn't work, and what is it that you did that made it
Look, it was like building a really complicated house. I was just talking to Leo about architecture. It was building a really complicated house where you might have a decent plumber and a decent HVAC person, but no general contractor. So the general contractor was HHS. They were the systems integrator, and nothing was working together. So there were over 700 software bugs already identified. One of the first moves we made was to hire a division of United Healthcare called Optum. Optum's CEO, who was running, a $30, $40 billion business, parked himself here in DC, and they became the integrator. We supported all of that. Another scary moment, I was at my daughter's freshman year parents' weekend at Duke. So it was that year, it was in that fall when they do the parents' weekend. And this CEO calls me and says, I got bad news. I said, what's that? Thinking maybe 700 bugs had gone to 800. He said, you not only have a major software problem, you have a major hardware problem, which makes meeting that deadline even worse. So that was another
So what did you
bad
do?
moment. We prioritized like hell. We did what I think, if there's something that I've gotten okay at across my career, is putting together teams.
Okay.
And we did a combination of some of the people who were on the project. We brought in some new people. I called John Doerr one Saturday morning, and that evening he had two people, some of the top technology fix-it people in the country out from the West Coast to help. So it was a combination of private sector, public sector, this contractor stepping up, a lot of prioritization, a lot of scary moments, and probably a combination of good work and smart work and a little bit of luck. It worked.
Well, that had been me, and I had fixed it. I would have gone in the president and say, well, thanks for giving me this opportunity, and now I'm going to be the head of the NEC as you wanted me to be, but actually I deserve to be Secretary of Treasury now. You didn't say, give me a bigger job because look what I did to save you? You didn't do that?
Jack Lew had left the Chief of Staff job to become Treasury Secretary, so that job was taken.
All right, taken, okay. Otherwise you could have said that. Okay, so so you ran the NEC for how much?
3 years.
2 years. All right, and what were the great economic accomplishments that you had?
Well, look, I think the big economic accomplishment across that period of time was, think about when President Obama came into office in the Great Recession and where we were at that point in time, losing 800,000 jobs a month. And by the time the president left office, unemployment was below 5%, wages were increasing. We were in a period of very divided government, so there weren't a lot of legislative opportunities. We really stretched our team as to what can we do through our own executive authority. We set up registered apprenticeships across the country. We really started these manufacturing hubs that brought academic institutions, companies, states, federal government together to create advanced manufacturing. And I think it really contributed to good, well-paying middle-class jobs that today is part of the larger Biden strategy of investing in America.
But you can't say, well, under President Biden, we've created more jobs than we did under President Obama, because you'd be saying you didn't create enough jobs when you were in charge of the economy, right? So you
well, it's a bigger economy, and we had inherited this time a terrible
So
pandemic. So there's been 15 million jobs. The unemployment rate's below 4% for over 2 years now, which is a record. So the economy is in remarkably good shape, with more work to be done.
When you were there at the end of the administration, right?
Yes.
So what was the transition like to the incoming Trump administration? Was that smooth?
So President Obama, I remember this vividly, gathered us in the Roosevelt Room, which is right outside the Oval Office, where I do my 8:40 meeting each morning with the top 30 or 40 people in the White House. And Dennis was running a similar meeting at the time. He came in and he said, look, it's the summer of 2016. He said, President Bush did a world-class transition that we all benefited from. We need to do at least as well. And if possible, I want us to try to do even better. So we became very focused on transition. I'd say a third of my NEC team was working on coordinating with all the economic agencies. What are the top issues? What are the key staff positions? What are the risks that are on the horizon? We prepped like crazy. No, not knowing whether we were going to be handing that off to or working with a President Clinton or a President Trump. We ended up not spending a lot of time with the Trump team.
They weren't that interested.
I think it took them a while to identify who was going to have each position,
Okay.
and then there wasn't a high degree of interest.
For President-elect Biden, you were in charge of the entire transition. What was that transition like with the little delayed, I guess, for a while, wasn't it?
Well, it started this time, meaning around now in 2020. So before the president was even the nominee, we started working on it. Transitions are a big deal. I mean, there's thousands of positions that need to be filled. When you're going from a Republican administration to a Democratic administration or vice versa, there's been a lot of policy differences. So there's three big things that you're doing during a transition. I think the most important, and for me the most exciting, is helping the president put together his team, starting with the cabinet. But there's also thousands of positions that don't need to go through the Senate that can start on day one. So our goal was, in what we correctly forecast as probably the most difficult transition environment ever. Think about the pandemic, what was happening in the economy, and then we were worried that we might have an outgoing administration that was not as supportive of the transition as we had been.
Okay.
So our goal was to have the best transition in the most difficult environment ever. You know, what we were able to achieve with the cabinet, more than 1,000 people started on day one. The prior record was 300. The transition, and then importantly, we had our 100-day legislative priorities and executive action priorities. That's the second piece of a transition, is putting together your policy priorities. The third piece is having teams of experienced people land at the agencies to understand what's going on. And they oftentimes become part of the future team of those agencies. Last thing I'll say is we couldn't get those teams into the agencies in early November as planned. It wasn't for weeks later that we could have those.
Now, the legislation that existed then said that the President of the United States had to authorize the head of GSA to begin the transition. That legislation has now been changed, I think, so that there's some different mechanism, and I guess it makes it easier for transitions to occur. But when you're the head of a transition for an entire presidential administration, do you get people calling you from grade school, high school, college saying, I really deserve this job, and by the way, I'm going to let you know I'm interested in it? Or does that, that happen a lot?
You get to rekindle some relationships. It's fun. Yeah.
So how do you get a lot more friends, or how do you tell people you're not going to get that job, or who does that?
Look, these jobs are very hard. It takes a lot to figure out the right person. And it's a big team, so some people might not get the job they dreamt about, but there are other alternatives. Some people also end up serving later in an administration, not at the beginning.
Okay. So at the beginning of this administration, you were not the chief of staff. Your job was to make certain that the vaccines actually worked and got in people's arms. What plan did you inherit from the previous administration about getting those needles in people's arms?
There really was no plan. We were at war and there was no war plan. So we spent time during the transition. I've switched from leading the transition with Senator Kaufman, who was the
former chief of staff,
to then Senator Biden, and became a senator when Biden became vice president. And he wrote the legislation that you're talking about on transition. So it was a real honor to serve with Ted Kaufman. The nub of your question was?
Well, what was the situation you did to get the
so no plan,
in the arms?
No plan whatsoever. And I switched from running the transition around January, the beginning of January, to getting ready for COVID. So we put together a plan which was to secure enough vaccine supply. There wasn't enough vaccine supply secured by the prior administrations. We worked with Pfizer and Moderna to get enough. More than enough was our thought, overwhelm the problem. Second, to get enough places where people could get vaccinated. Remember how we set up at stadiums, mass vaccination sites? That was deploying the military to be vaccinators at those sites and run those sites. And then just, there weren't enough vaccinators, period, so we worked with the National Guard and got more vaccination capacity, and FEMA did an extraordinary job. We set a goal of 100 million shots in 100 days, which, again, a little bit like healthcare.gov, where did that goal come from? Well, it had to be big, and we did over 200 million in the first 100 days.
So I remember part of your plan at one point was to get CVS or Walgreens or the equivalent to do the vaccinations. I remember when I first heard, I said, you mean the person that does the checkout when I go to CVS, he's going to be putting in or she's going to be putting in the arm? I was a little nervous that I was going to have a checkout person doing it, but I guess it was the pharmacist that was doing it.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
I was
and
worried.
they stepped up. The private sector, Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid, they all stepped up in a big way, and a lot of people got vaccinated
Okay.
at
All right, so
pharmacies.
the typical day of the President of the United States, he gets up at what time?
He gets up on the early side, he gets his workout in, does his reading, and then he'll review his presidential daily briefing, which is the intelligence and national security, though we meet on that later in the day. I'm usually his first meeting, sometime between 9 and 10.
Okay, so he works out every day, more or less every day. And does he have a trainer, or does he do it himself, or
I'll leave that
is that
to
a
the
state
president.
secret?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a secret.
All right, okay.
How you can look that good is a secret.
Okay, so he comes in the Oval Office roughly what time?
Between 9 and 10.
9 and 10. Now, some presidents like to work in the Oval Office, and some like to work off the side office with the smaller one. What does he like to do?
He's in the Oval a lot. He's in the Roosevelt Room, which I mentioned earlier, when groups of CEOs come in, or legislators from the Hill. And then he does use, there's a dining room off the Oval, a private dining room that can sit 3 or 4, 5 people. He uses that quite a bit. I tend to block that time on my calendar, because if he's having lunch with Secretary Blinken the other day, and oftentimes I get called down to, as he's getting feedback from other folks. So
some presidents, I think Ronald Reagan was one of them, maybe Donald Trump, had a view that if you're in the Oval Office, you have to wear a coat and tie. You just don't show up in jeans in the Oval Office. Is that his view, or he always has his coat and tie on when he's in the Oval?
he wears a coat and tie. Last weekend or the weekend before, I guess it was last weekend, when Israel, the situation in the Middle East, obviously everyone was in all weekend. Sometimes he'll just have a coat, no tie. But it's a pretty formal place for good reason.
So presidents either decide typically by reading memos or by oral briefings, and there's no right or wrong way. Which way does he like to decide, by meeting with people or reading the memos?
Both. Obama was more reading memos, and the memos are a strict format, and you can either accept the recommendation, say no, or say discuss. President Biden usually wants to discuss. He wants experts in the room, and he likes to hear people's thinking. He likes to hear the debate.
So there's usually a staff system where memos are gathered, and they go into the president maybe once or twice or 3 times a day, and then the president reads the memo and makes the decision and so forth. I used to go in late at night when I was working in the White House and put my memo on top, so he would read that first, go around the staff system. Do you have anybody else trying to do that?
We run a tighter ship than
you're
that,
right?
yeah.
Okay. Well, another thing that's often tighter maybe is that there's a thing called walk-in privileges. Some presidents said X, Y, or Z can walk in anytime. Does anybody have walk-in privileges other than chief of staff?
Yeah, I think everybody has a good sense of what is one of our most important jobs, which is how important the president's time is and where he spends his time. So the senior advisors, we spend a lot of time thinking that through. That's part of our Saturday session, is the allocation of the president's time. But yes, there's many people on my team who, if they say to the president's assistant, I need a little bit of time, they get that time. They're close advisors, and they have good judgment, and they know not to abuse that time. And the president will want to hear from them.
Right, so typically in a typical day, the president will wrap up by 5 o'clock, go home.
Usually later than that.
6 o'clock, he goes home.
Usually dinner is more like 7, 7:30.
All right, so he goes home. Does he lug home papers to read during the night?
Yes. He has a book. I have a book too, sort of a government thing. One of the things I do when I wake up early is go through my book, which is the material for that day. So if I'm meeting on a certain issue, it's the memo, or if we're meeting with the president, for me, or if we're meeting with the president, it's the memo that went to the president. It's the agenda that the team's going to follow, what the run of show is going to be with the president, what the issues are likely to be. So that's the prep for the day. He has his book. And
Does he come back in the morning and he's always read everything, or he said, I didn't have time to read, I was watching a TV show or something?
Baseball.
Baseball, I was
The
watching
Orioles,
that,
yeah.
or watching the Orioles.
No, but he's consumed all of that, and as I said, some of it's just returned as a decision, but it oftentimes, one of the things we do first thing when I meet with him is go through the book.
Okay.
You know, what does he want to meet on? What are his questions? And how do we map out the day?
So when I was working in the White House a long time ago, Rosalind Carter wanted to make sure she knew what the president was doing in his substantive way, and they didn't have time to do that during their family hours, so she would have a lunch once a week with the president, talk about policy matters. Is that, Dr.
No.
Biden doesn't do that?
No, there's no set meeting with the First Lady. Now, the First Lady's
Does he have
incredibly important part of this team, but there's not that kind of
Does
policy.
he have a regular meeting with the vice president? Does that
Yes. One of those lunches most weeks that I
Vice
described in the outer oval dining room is with the Vice President.
So does the president ever get mad and curse, or he never does that?
Yeah, you know, sometimes he gets frustrated. Some of the places he gets most frustrated is when he sees what I was talking about earlier, which is where the federal government doesn't operate efficiently or fast enough. That gets his blood boiling, as it does mine.
Now, I noticed in recent weeks he's stopped talking about the other guy or the previous guy. He uses a name for the person who was the previous guy. Is that a conscious decision to use the name, or that just happened?
Well, I'm here in my official chief of staff.
You're a Hatch Act person, so you cannot talk about that as a political.
Not when I'm here in my official capacity.
Okay. All right, so you can't comment on that.
No.
Okay. Well, can you comment on this?
Yes.
Does the president enjoy the job? Does he like doing this job? He spent almost 48 years of his life thinking about being president, more than anybody else in our country's history. From the age of 30 to the time he was elected in 78, he's been a potential candidate, and he got elected when he was 78.
Look, he's so qualified for the job that there aren't, as hard as it is,
Okay.
you don't bring issues into the Oval Office that he hasn't seen some variety of prior to, given his years as vice president, senator, his foreign policy knowledge, his relationships on the Hill. So it's hard. I mean, you know, you never walk in there with good news. It's funny, Dennis McDonough would say, you know, something good would happen. And he'd be like, great, I'm going to walk down the hall. It's just, 25 yards, go into the Oval and tell the president, this is Obama. And Obama would say, hey, Dennis. And Dennis would say, I got a piece of good news. Obama would say, I've already heard it. Then when there's really shitty news, which is quite often, no one's ever told the president that, and that's the job of the chief of staff. So good news travels fast, not so good news, which is one of the primary responsibilities of being chief of staff, is to share the good, bad, and the ugly, and there's a lot of bad and ugly. You get to do a lot of that.
Good news travels at the speed of light.
Yes.
The most important issue many people are focused on, and I realize it's not a political issue, but just you see him every day, several times a day. Can you talk about his age? He's 70, right now he's 81 years old.
Yes.
I did, thanks to you, did an interview for a book I'm doing, and I got an interview with him. I had an interview with him for about an hour 2 weeks ago or so, but I don't see him as much as you do, so how would you assess his age and his ability to do this job for the next 4 years?
I think he's extraordinary. It's what I talked about before, his experience, his compassion, his values, and he's totally on top of his game. There's a big disconnect for those of us who work with him every day and see him at his most difficult moments in terms of policy issues. When we see him out traveling the country, we just don't get it. I'm not saying perception isn't a challenge here, but he is so on top of his game and is so demanding and pushes us so hard.
Okay.
That there's a big disconnect.
All right, without violating the Hatch Act, can you just say, why does he want to be president again? In other words, let's suppose he's done the job for 4 years, he'll be 82 if he's inaugurated again, or you would say when he's inaugurated again. Why does he want to do this for the ages of 82, 3, 4,
Look,
5?
I think he knows there's a lot of unfinished business. There's the implementation of all the legislation that's been passed, and we're just in the middle of that implementation. And we talked about the importance of implementation. There's more work to be done in areas like housing and child care. There's obviously a lot of work still to be done with America's leadership in the world, and I think he thinks he's the best person to do it.
Okay, so if he is reelected, or you think when he is reelected, you think you have the stamina to do another job for 4 more years?
Look, I think the next 9 months are going to be really hard, as the last 9 months have been. I feel pretty good right now, and that sense of feeling pretty good is that I think I have a really good team. The president has a really good
how do
team.
you-
So we'll see where we are. If he asked me, and I have fuel in the tank, it would be an honor to continue.
Well, last time you left the government, you got involved in an entrepreneurial venture. And if I recall it, I think I have it right here, it was a bagel shop.
Oh, that venture, yeah.
So this was, you don't own anything anymore, you had to sell it. Call your mother bagels. Anybody ever heard of this? How did you come to buy, not that bagels are not great, but it wouldn't strike me that, that this was your focus. So how did you come to be an owner of this bagel store?
Well, first of all, having spent now, I can't believe I'm saying this, but 12 years in the federal government and 20 odd years in business in DC, if I'm out to eat and someone comes up to me, this is all they ever ask me about is the bagel shop.
Okay, so
Yeah. So it was after Obama. I was trying to figure out what to do next. I never thought of this being my primary activity, but I grew up here, as we talked about. There are no good bagels in DC, so I did what like a nerdy person does. I got a small team together, and one of their projects was to go around the country and find the best bagels, the best deli concepts. They came back with all these photos and menus and a business plan, and then I was like, oh, that's interesting, but what do I do now? Luckily, I found an entrepreneur, a guy named Andrew Dana, and he's an extraordinary entrepreneur. He always wanted to do a bagel shop, and there's now 16, 17, and they're continue to just crush it. Because it's the best bagel.
Well, I can see, it's very good. I just had one of them.
You gave me some bagels.
Well, your favorite
I
is...
see you had one. I appreciate this.
Well, I was saving it for you, but so it was very good. But my question is, why would owning a bagel chain be a conflict of interest? Why did you have to sell it? You could have just owned it, and who would have thought that that's a conflict?
Look, when you're in these types of positions, and it's true at a place like Treasury or Commerce or whatever, you can only own widely held mutual funds. So not even like an industry fund. It has to be a widely held and not industry-specific mutual fund. And so could you own something like this and have no conflicts and just recuse? Yes, but I just thought it was simpler to just have nothing other than those.
Right. So why, as we get to the end now, how do you stay in shape? This is a job where you're working all the time. How do you exercise and get time to do anything other than just work?
Yeah. So I mentioned my morning routine. I'm religious about that. It's because I think it's good for you, but the few days that I miss, I feel crappy. I don't know if that's physical or psychological, but I feel crappy. So as tired as I am, first of all, I have my 4 shots of espresso, do some reading, and then I go, and part of my motivation is if I don't do it, I'm going to feel like crap. I have done, I think 8 now, half marathons since I've been in the job, so Sunday mornings.
Really?
Yes,
I have thought about that.
Run might be I've completed with a slow jog 8.
But I mean, you do a half marathon in, how long does it take?
2 hours.
2 hours. That's what I do a full marathon in, but roughly 2 hours.
Amazing.
Yeah, I can
you
drive.
got those special
Well, I can
Nike shoes.
drive the marathon in 2 hours if I drive it. So you have 4 children?
4 children.
And are they proud to say you're the chief of staff of the President of the United States, or they don't mention it?
I don't think they don't mention it a
They don't
lot.
mention
They're
it.
great kids. They're all in California now. None were in California 3.5 years ago. Does not make my wife happier. But and they're all doing good for the world, which is the thing I'm most proud of.
Okay, so if you were to convey to somebody who doesn't know the President of the United States something about the President of the United States, if you just want to summarize your observation of this man, what would you summarize it as in 30 seconds? What would you say about this person that you would like people to know that they may not know?
I think that he sees everything through the lens of how he grew up and the values that he has. So he's constantly asking us, how does this policy impact working Americans? He's very tough on me and the whole team on how do you explain this to an average American? Get out of the bubble of DC. How do you speak in plain English and tell people what the problem is, what the opportunity is, what we're doing about it? But he always has in mind the people he grew up with in Scranton, Pennsylvania. That's why he went there 2 days ago. So he sees everything through that lens.
Yeah, he told me a story. I was talking about his mother and whether his mother actually lived to see him be president. She didn't, but she lived to see him be vice president. And he was telling me a story that I'll repeat. I don't think it's right out of confidence. I'm sure he didn't tell it to me only. He's probably told it to other people. But it was that he was asked by President-elect Obama to be vetted to be president or vice president. And he said, I don't want to be vice president. And he said, I don't want to be. And eventually he said, look, you got to be vetted. You're the only one. I'm not really having three. I'm pretending I'm having three, but you're the one. And so he went home and talked to his mother, and he said, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be vice president. He said, what do you mean? Here's a chance to be the vice president of the United States for the first African-American ever elected president of the United States, and you're going to turn that down? Call him back and tell him you're going to take the job. And that's what he said. I don't know if that's true. You may have heard that story before.
I have. And I think it's consistent with what I said. If the President of the United States asks you to do something and you can do it,
so does the President does the President ever have a view on private equity? Has he ever mentioned that much or not so much? Never.
No.
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 Wow.
No.
Well, okay, if he ever wants to be educated on it, no. So, look, Jeff, I know you got to go back to the White House. You agreed to give a certain amount of time. I want to thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Look, I don't know if you're allowed to take these bagels back.
I am.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.